Man City and Belgium football star Kevin de Bruyne was forced off in yesterday's Champions League final, and now the full details of his injury have been revealed to be much more severe than we might have initially thought. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and this is your #1 source for learning about the unique medical side of the world of sports. A lot of implications here with Euros coming up, so let's dive right in and talk about what happened with de Bruyne and kind of go over the anatomy and what we might expect for his recovery. You guys know what to do if you want to help support this channel, so let's dive right in and take a look at when this injury occurred. So here in the second half, we saw de Bruyne made contact with Rudiger, and initially it was tough to really see where the true contact was. Certainly we were worried about a concussion, which the announcers pointed out pretty well, but on replays here, it basically looks like Rudiger's shoulder made contact just below de Bruyne's eye. There certainly didn't look to be any direct head-to-head contact, so shoulder to the area below the eye. It was hard to catch a really clear view of when the contact was made, but from this angle, we can at least see that the shoulder would have been, again, what contacted just below de Bruyne's left eye. As de Bruyne was getting up, we immediately saw a pretty worrisome sign here. So we can already tell how he's got some swelling and bruising, or what we would call ecchymosis, below that left eye. And when we see that immediate bruising, that's a worrisome sign for an underlying fracture to the orbital bone. This morning, we got this update from the best source possible with all this, saying that he had a diagnosis of an acute nose bone fracture and a left orbital fracture. And with the group stage of the Euros just over a week away, of course, the last thing that Belgium fans want to hear is that he's got an orbital fracture. Let's talk about these injuries looking at our biodigital anatomy tools. So first off, the acute nose fracture. Acute just means sudden or recent, as opposed to chronic, meaning long-term. So of course, this is going to be acute because it was there right then, sudden in the moment. When we look at our skull here, the only true nasal bones is actually just up at the very top, or the bridge of the nose. As you push around and move on your nose, everything you're pushing and moving around is just cartilage until you get up to the very bridge. That's going to be where the actual bones themselves are at. Deep up inside the nasal cavity, we do have a lot of smaller, thin bones that I've got highlighted here. But when we talk about just a true nasal bone fracture, we're talking about a fracture to this little bone here at the ridge of the nose. Typically, these aren't going to require surgery unless there's a massive amount of displacement or there's any potential injury to the septum, which is going to be that more midline soft tissue with inside the nose. So the nasal fracture, I'm not as concerned about. If it were just that, I wouldn't be worried about him playing for the Euros. But now when we get to the orbital fracture, that's where things, of course, get more severe. First off, you have to recognize there's not just a single orbital bone. The orbit is generally the entire skull socket where the eye lives, but there's not a single orbital bone. It's a group of bones that all come together to form that socket. That's going to consist of the frontal bone forming that roof of the orbital socket, the zygomatic bone, kind of the lateral and lower floor of the orbital socket, the maxilla or the upper jaw bone that kind of forms the true floor of the socket, the ethmoid bone here in pink, more on the inside, and then the sphenoid bone in the back lateral portion of the socket. So you can see there's all kinds of different bones that come together here to form the orbit. It's not a single one. If we look back at the bruising pattern on de Bruyne here, we can see that it's below or inferior to his eye. So then if we go back to our anatomy, we're kind of looking somewhere in this general region where we would expect that fracture to have occurred. That breaks it down into more specifically the zygomatic bone, which forms that prominence that you feel on your cheek, and then the maxilla. One distinction here, often in sports we'll hear about an orbital blowout instead of an orbital fracture. We can define these fractures to whether they occur on the rim of the orbit, meaning that just outer portion, that outer border, or if they're in the orbital floor, which we would consider a blowout. With a blowout, there's no direct trauma to the bone. There's basically trauma to the front of the eye, which causes pressure to build up within that orbital socket, and that pressure basically causes the bone to act like a crumple zone and just break away to dissipate that force. As opposed to with the orbital rim here, that's going to be more that direct trauma to the bone that's going to cause the fracture. Of course, the proximity to the eyeball is why these orbital fractures can be so serious. Specifically, one of the things we worry about is entrapment of the extraocular muscles. So our eyeball is covered by all these different extraocular muscles that control the specific movement of our eyeball. And those muscles are anchored to these bones of the orbit. So when you get an orbital fracture, you can get damage and entrapment of these eye muscles, which can affect somebody's vision because then the eyes can't move synchronously with one another. That's often one of the indications for having surgery, is if we have entrapment or involvement of any of these eye muscles. Finally, let's talk about recovery time, because that's probably what most of you are interested in hearing about. The first question is, does he need surgery for that orbital fracture? If you look at just general recommendations for facial fractures within sports medicine, you're going to typically see around 6 weeks. That's because of the time required for the bone to properly heal. Now, you will see a lot of variety in that though, depending on whether or not surgery is required and the specific details of each individual fracture. But I think it's safe to assume a minimum of around 3 weeks before we'd see him back in action. And even then, it would only be if he's able to wear a protective face shield in order to protect those fractures while they continue to heal. The return to play is often dictated by the presence of other injuries or the complications with the injury. And so it's really hard to give a specific for De Bruyne, but again, I would plan for a minimum of around 3 weeks and be really happy if it's sooner, but not be disappointed if it's a little bit longer. If we look back at Belgium's schedule, I'd be shocked if he played in the first match of the group stage, but maybe by match 3 he could be fit. And then certainly if they advance beyond the group stage, then I would get more optimistic about him coming back to play. So that's it for the video, everybody. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below. Hope you found this interesting and were able to learn something here. And until next time, we'll see you later.